Hello, History 361. So today we're going to continue our exploration of culture and society in 5th century Athens. And we're going to actually start looking at the dark side of the Athenian democracy, particularly slavery in Athens. Now, we've already encountered one form of unfreedom in the Greek world, and this is the helots of Laconia and Messenia. Importantly, the helots are what we might describe as serfs. Of course, here I'm using a medieval term, but they are bound to the land. So they exist in a state of unfreedom. They are subject to violent coercion, and they are economically exploited by being required to give up a portion of their agricultural surplus to their Spartan masters. There, however, is an advantage to being a serf. And that is, while you're stuck on the land, you also can't be removed from it unwillingly. So you are there with your family on your farm in a place where you're at least familiar with, and you can't be taken away from your family and sold somewhere else, the kind of tragedy so closely associated with chattel slavery in the United States. Now, there are other forms of serfdom in the Greek world. One other type that we know of are a class of agrarian workers called penastai in Thessaly, who also seem to be serfs, people bound to the land and required to give up a portion of their surplus to aristocratic masters. Now, the slaves in Athens are chattel slaves. They are, therefore, they can be bought and sold freely, and they are not necessarily bound to any one location or place. The term for chattel slave in Greek is doulos, a male, masculine singular, plural douloi, and a female slave is a doula. And incidentally, that term has entered our modern idiom as a type of midwife, a doula. But it comes from the Greek word for a female slave. Douloi in Athens come from a number of different places. And I think one thing that is important to note as we consider the nature of slavery in Athens is unlike chattel slavery in the United States, slavery in Athens is not racially based or even ethnically based. One thing that is important to note, the Greeks, while they were hopelessly xenophobic and disliked people who came from other parts of the world, did not have the kind of concept of scientific racism that developed in the 18th and 19th and into the 20th centuries in the modern world, that creates the racial categories that we still assume today, white, black. That took a tremendous amount of intellectual labor, and the Greeks simply do not have those kinds of categories. They don't walk around and say, "Oh, well, wait, who's white, who's not white? What is the underpinnings of all these differences?" They do note that different populations look differently. They oftentimes think of people who come from various genetic populations as being ugly, even. But again, they don't have a kind of systematic view that we could describe as racial categories. So in a strange way, there's no real race in the ancient world, and there's therefore no racism, even if there's rampant xenophobia. Greeks really oftentimes do not like people who come from other places, speak other languages, or look differently in various ways than they do. But it's a kind of general xenophobia rather than one that's determined by entrenched racial silos. That's really a product of the modern age, a product that we still, in some ways, are shackled with today. So while slavery in Athens is not racially based, certainly a significant proportion of the slaves in Athens are foreigners. And by foreigners, I mean non-Greeks, what the Greeks might consider barbarians. Now, there are different ways to become a slave. The most common way is to actually be captured and trafficked by outsiders. So there are certainly peoples who live outside of the Greek world who engage in slave raiding and slave trading. This would include various kind of barbarian peoples like the Thracians, who actually are seen as a major source of slaves. A substantial chunk of the Athenian slave population is probably from Thrace, from what's now kind of modern day Bulgaria and the North Balkans. You can also become a slave by being captured by pirates. Many pirates are essentially, in the ancient Mediterranean, are kind of merchants and traffickers who go around kidnapping people and then selling them into slavery. And so this is another source of kind of non-Greek slaves into Athenian slave markets. Even though a significant chunk of Athenian slaves are foreign, they're Thracians, they're Scythians, they are Pisidians, Cappadocians, whatnot. A significant chunk is also Greek. That is, when Greeks engage in warfare with one another, the common fate of captives is to be enslaved. Sometimes this includes captured prisoners of war, although not infrequently they're simply killed, or if they're not killed, they're ransomed. But if you invest a city in a siege and succeed in capturing that city, it's not uncommon to engage in a practice called andropodismos, which involves killing the men and then enslaving the women and the children. The children would also be a source of male slaves as they're raised. And presumably the reason for killing the men is they're not particularly docile. They may not immediately make good slaves. But if you take a child, you can essentially, probably through a great deal of physical abuse, socialize them into being more docile slaves. Again, the slave population in Athens is going to consist of both Greeks who have been captured in warfare and sold into slavery, as well as foreigners who, again, likely in their own societies, have been captured in warfare and then trafficked through a robust system of human trafficking that is, again, a major industry in the ancient Mediterranean, both classical Greece and well beyond. Slaves in Athens participate in almost all aspects of the economy. The most miserable slaves, not just in Athens, but probably the most miserable slaves in the entire Greek world, are those who work in the mines of Laurion. This is deadly, dangerous work, whether you're being put into these unstable caverns to actually extract the silver ore, or if it's your job to actually smelt the ore, and silver is extracted as an alloy that consists of silver and lead, and the smelting and purification process basically involves cooking off the lead, and in doing so it emits huge amounts of lead fumes that must have just quite quickly poisoned the unfortunate workers who were given that task. So the slaves at Laurion probably have a profoundly miserable existence, and indeed when the Peloponnesian War, which we will get to shortly, takes place in its last phase, the Spartan strategy for undermining Athens is actually to find ways to encourage as many of these miserable mining slaves to defect to the Spartan side. But slaves work in other industries, and actually in many instances under better conditions. So you'll find slaves who work as agricultural hands, slaves who work in various craft industries, say potters or cobblers, slaves who work in the construction industry, including those who build the great monuments of Athens, like the Erechtheion and the Parthenon. We also know that a substantial number of slaves worked in the sex industry. Not all, but many, probably the significant majority of sex workers, both male and female, are enslaved. And it also seems that even within the context of household slavery, since a good number of slaves are what we might today call household slaves. They are owned by Athenian families who use them as essentially servants, as field hands, as domestic workers, nannies, whatnot. It seems that it's quite common to have sexual relations with at least some of these slaves. Again, this is just a widely accepted form of slave exploitation. Now, we should ask, how many slaves are there? Unfortunately, we don't know for sure. The Athenians kept pretty good records of how many hoplites they could call up, how many medics were subject to taxation, but they did not keep particularly good records of how many slaves there were. Modern estimates I would say probably say somewhere between 50 to 100,000 slaves in Attica, and you're putting that against a free population that consists of, at its peak in the efflorescence of the 5th century, 50 to 60,000 adult male citizens, with an equal number both of women and children, and that's sort of a general demographic model that suggests that you'll have roughly the same number of men and women and the same number of children as men. So overall, I think we can guess that there's maybe 150 to 180,000 free citizens, and again, as a guess, 50 to 100,000 slaves. There could have been more. Even if that sort of rough ballpark estimate, which I'm throwing out, is correct, that means a substantial portion of the people who live in Attica under the Athenian democracy are slaves who have no rights. They do not even own themselves. And indeed, let's just take a middle number. Let's say there's 75,000 servile people, men, women, children, in Athens, enslaved people. If there's 50 or 60,000 adult male citizens, it's not unlikely, in fact, it's quite likely, that there were more enslaved people in Attica than there were people able to vote in the Athenian democracy. This is Moses Finley, the great historian of the ancient economy, considered Athens and to be fundamentally one of the slave societies of the world. And while we can debate what it means to be a slave society, I think that's basically correct. This is a society where slavery was ubiquitous, where a substantial portion of the population was enslaved, and where clearly notions of slavery were used to articulate what it meant to be free. And this is also not an uncommon aspect of slave societies, is in some ways, ironically, they have stronger notions of freedom in precisely because they know what it means to be a slave. You claim, the rights that Athenian male citizens claim are in part the right not to suffer all of the things that they impose upon their own slaves. Now, that being said, there is a real tension in Athenian society, despite the fact that you have this, in theory, quite clear dichotomy between slaves who have no rights and citizens who are the power behind the democracy. And that is in many of the industries where slaves work, they are indistinguishable from free Athenian citizens who work alongside them. Free citizens work as agricultural laborers. Free citizens work as potters and cobblers and construction workers and in the shipyards, oftentimes side by side with slaves. Again, this in some ways is a paradox, because you can't actually tell who is a slave and who is a free citizen if you're walking down a street in Athens. The Athenians even have a law that says you can't strike someone you think is a slave. And why not? Well, you might be wrong. They might actually be a citizen, and now you've committed assault and battery against a fellow citizen. So because you can't tell them apart, because they work in the same industries, they wear similar clothes, therefore, just hold back. And it does seem that there is a vigorous, and I think this is a result of this tension, that you can't immediately tell who's free and who's slave. There is deep anxieties that slaves will simply assume the appearance and the rights of citizens. And there's actually a whole host of documented suits where people bring prosecutions against fellow citizens, and the accusation is, no, you aren't a citizen, you're actually a slave pretending to be a citizen. In some ways, this is a petty way to harass someone that you don't like, a personal enemy. But the fact that it is that you can harass them in this way, I think suggests that there is this real tension, that even though the legal differences between citizen and slave are huge in Athens, these are also people who literally are working together in the same workshop, wearing the same clothes, eating the same food, and on the face of it, there don't appear to be all that many differences. Now, it was possible as a slave to gain your freedom through manumission. Now, that said, in Athens, manumission was not a legally easy thing to do. I mean, it happens, but there isn't an obvious legal mechanism the way there is, say, for Rome. So, for those of you who've taken the Roman Republic or Roman Empire with me, manumission is insanely easy in Roman law. There are a number of different ways that you can do it. You can manumit somebody in your will. You can manumit them simply by bringing them before a magistrate and declaring them to be free. It's very easy to manumit a slave. Not only that, in Roman law, once you manumit a slave, they become Roman citizens. And indeed, there's a few legal kind of constraints to their exercise of citizen rights, but they can vote in assemblies, they can own property, and they can also then marry and have children who are full Roman citizens who can have no constraints. They can run for office, which, for example, is something that a freed person can't do. Things aren't as neat and easy in Athens. There isn't an easy legal mechanism, and the most common legal mechanism that people hit upon is fictional sale to a god. So you have a slave that you want to free. Oftentimes that slave has done extra work to accumulate a bit of money of their own that they then give to you, so that essentially they buy their own freedom. But frequently you will create this fiction that you are selling the slave to a god, and we actually have a whole wall of inscriptions at the great Pan-Hellenic sanctuary at Delphi that actually document these fictional sales. And so essentially they're still slaves, but if you're a slave to the god, kind of you're okay at least on the ground. No one else can come and say, oh, you were my slave. You're like, oh, no, there's this inscription on the wall. You can see I'm clearly the slave to Apollo. Now, many of these manumission contracts indicate that the sale to the god is conditional. Oftentimes, the slave still owes in the sale contract duties to their master. That if those duties aren't performed, and many of these duties are basically the same thing they did as slaves, then the contract, the sale to the god is void, and they revert to their servile status. One interesting thing to note, a historian named Deborah Common at the University of Washington has actually studied these inscriptions, and her argument from sort of the verbiage of these inscriptions, many of which seem to show a degree of affection towards the slave, suggests that in many of these cases of manumission, the slave and the master making the sale were in probably a sexual, perhaps even, at least from the master's perspective, a romantic relationship. Again, a reminder of just how fundamental sexual exploitation was to ancient slavery, and frankly also to modern slavery. But it does seem that one factor why someone might be manumitted was precisely because the slave master was in their own way, in love with the slave, or at least had a warm feeling for the slave. So manumission is possible, although again it's not easy, and again the sort of workaround of sale to a god seems to be the most common way in which manumission is effected in Athens. So I guess in terms of our kind of takeaways for slavery in Athens, Athens is a slave society. Slaves, douloi, are chattel slaves who can be bought and sold. They are a mix of foreigners who have been captured in warfare or raiding abroad and trafficked into Greek slave markets, as well as Greeks who have been captured in the context of Greek-on-Greek warfare. Slaves work in every industry in Athens, especially though in the silver mines of Laurion. Manumission is a possibility for Greek slaves, although nowhere near as easy as it is in later Roman times. So again, in many ways, slavery is a dark aspect of Athens. Again, there is probably more freedom. There is more unfreedom in Athens than there is suffrage, voting. But in some ways, and again, we will see this elsewhere, it may be the ubiquity of slavery is one reason why we have such a strong manifestation of what it means to be free in Athens.